The distress signal pulsed through the void of space, a faint, desperate beacon. Lost among the stars, for weeks it repeated its call, unwavering, unchanging, until the human vessel Odyssey caught the faint whisper of it drifting through the Andromeda system. Its crew gathered in the dimly lit command deck, staring at the decrypted message flashing across their screens. It was a plea for help, a cry from a civilization long thought dead. Captain Rourke stood at the helm, his face unreadable, as he read the coordinates of planet Erythea, a world once teeming with life, now a graveyard, orbiting a dying sun. Elias Carter, the ship's lead geneticist, leaned closer, his mind racing. He had studied Erythea before. It was an enigma, a world that had suddenly gone silent centuries ago, leaving behind no explanation, no trace of war, no sign of plague, just silence. But now that silence had been broken. As the Odyssey approached Erythea, the crew prepared for the unknown. The planet's surface came into view, a sprawling expanse of abandoned cities, shattered spires, reaching toward the storm-filled sky. Dust storms howling through empty streets, no signs of movement, no signs of life. Yet the signal continued, pulsing, unwavering. Beneath the ruins lay the last remnants of an empire on the brink of extinction. Descending to the surface in a reinforced dropship, the team moved cautiously through the ruins. Carter, his assistant Hannah Voss, and a small security escort, led by Officer Kane. The air was thin, charged with the scent of decay, yet deep beneath the layers of dust the structures still stood, monolithic and ancient, their designs far beyond human engineering. Then they saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, tall, slender, with luminescent eyes and bioluminescent patterns flowing along their skin. Their presence was almost ghostly, their bodies elegant yet frail, their gazes filled with something the human crew rarely saw in an advanced species. Desperation. Liara, their leader, stepped forward, her voice resonating in a language both melodic and sorrowful through translation devices. Her message was clear: we are dying, and only you can save us. The Erytheans led the humans deep into their underground sanctuaries, where their last remaining survivors huddled in dimly glowing halls. The walls pulsed with a faint organic light, a remnant of the once great biotech empire that had now withered. Liara explained their plight, her voice unwavering yet tinged with despair. Their kind had once mastered genetics, shaping their evolution at will. But their ambition had become their downfall. In their pursuit of perfection, they had rewritten their own genetic code, one time too many, until something broke deep within them. The ability to reproduce had faded, and now they stood on the precipice of extinction. Their last chance, their last hope, lay in the unlikeliest of sources: human DNA. Carter listened intently, his scientific mind racing. This was unprecedented, an entire species crippled by their own genius, unable to continue without outside intervention. He glanced at Hannah, who was already scanning samples taken from the Erytheans, her brows furrowed in concentration. This isn't just infertility, she muttered. It's complete genetic collapse. Their reproductive sequences have degraded beyond repair. It's like their own DNA is rejecting itself. It's not a disease, it's a countdown. Captain Rourke crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. You're saying they don't have years left? Hannah shook her head. Months, maybe less, if we don't do something. Silence settled over the group, broken only by the distant hum of decaying machinery. Carter turned back to Liara, his voice careful, measured. If what you say is true, then you're asking us to do something humanity has never done before: integrate our genetics with an alien race. This isn't just medicine, this is rewriting the fundamental laws of life. Liara met his gaze unflinching. Would you rather watch us die? The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of history and impossible decisions behind them. The last children of a dying race watched with hollow eyes, waiting for an answer that would determine the fate of their species. Deep within the underground sanctuaries of Erythea, the air was thick with tension. The faint bioluminescent glow of the alien structures cast eerie shadows across the walls as the last survivors of the once great civilization waited for humanity's answer. Elias Carter stood at the center of it all, staring at the genetic data flashing across his tablet, his mind racing with possibilities and consequences. Human DNA was compatible with Erythean biology in a way that defied known science. But altering the course of an entire species was more than just a scientific challenge, it was an ethical reckoning. Hannah Voss worked tirelessly beside him, her fingers gliding over the holographic interface, analyzing genetic sequences with surgical precision. She barely noticed the way the Erethians watched her with something bordering on reverence, as if she and the others were not just scientists but gods holding the power of creation in their hands. Captain Rourke paced behind them, his expression unreadable, his instincts as a soldier telling him to be wary, that something about this was more dangerous than it seemed. The debate among the crew had already begun. Some saw this as an unprecedented opportunity for scientific progress. Others saw it as meddling in forces beyond their understanding. Officer Keynes stood rigid, arms crossed, his voice sharp. When he finally spoke, "We're not talking about simple medicine here. We're talking about rewriting an entire species. What happens if this backfires? What if we introduce something into their DNA that they can't control?" Liara, the Erethian leader, stepped forward, her glowing eyes steady as she met Kane's gaze. "We have controlled our own evolution for millennia, but we went too far, and we have paid the price. We're not asking you to make us human, we are asking you to save us from oblivion." Her voice did not waver, but there was something raw in it, something desperate. Dr. Carter exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "There's no question that this is possible," he said at last. "Human DNA carries a unique adaptability that could stabilize your failing reproductive system, but this isn't a simple fix. It would mean introducing human genetic material into your species permanently. The children born from this process would not be purely Erethian, they would be hybrids." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the Erethians. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others whispered among themselves, but Liara remained unmoved. "Our people are dying," she said. "If we do nothing, there will be no more Erethians, no more cities, no more voices left to tell our story." Hannah studied the data again, her pulse quickening. The more she examined the samples, the more she realized how delicate the situation was. The Erethians weren't just infertile, their genetic material was unraveling, as if their very DNA had lost the will to exist. Their bodies were running on borrowed time. If something wasn't done soon, even those who still lived would begin to deteriorate. "We don't have time for endless debate," she said, suddenly earning sharp looks from both Kane and Rourke. "We can run simulations, take precautions. But if we hesitate too long, they won't be here to save." Captain Rourke let out a long breath, his jaw tightening, as he looked around the room at the skeletal remains of a once mighty civilization, at the hollow-eyed survivors who had spent their lives watching their people vanish one by one, at the scientists who had come seeking knowledge, but instead found themselves faced with the power to shape the fate of another species. He turned to Carter. "If we do this, there's no going back. Are you ready to play God?" Dr. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past Rourke toward the entrance of the chamber, where a group of young Erethians stood watching, their faces filled with equal parts fear and hope. He thought of Earth, of all the times humanity had faced extinction and fought back against impossible odds. He thought of how many had called humanity reckless, dangerous, arrogant, for pushing the limits of science, and yet it was that very nature that had allowed them to survive, to evolve, to reach the stars. Finally, he turned back to Liara, his expression resolute. "We'll do it, but we do it on our terms. Controlled trials, careful monitoring, no reckless shortcuts. We're saving your species, but we're making sure we don't destroy it in the process." Liara's shoulders relaxed, the barest hint of relief passing over her face, before she simply nodded. "Then let us begin." The laboratory deep beneath the ruins of Erythea pulsed with dim bioluminescent light as human scientists and Erethian researchers worked side by side. Sterile equipment from the Odyssey had been transported down, forming a makeshift genetic facility where the first trials would begin. Hannah Voss moved through the lab with sharp focus, her hands steady as she calibrated the sequencing machines beside her. Dr. Elias Carter reviewed the hybridization models, running endless simulations to predict possible outcomes, but no amount of calculations could account for the unknowns ahead. Across the room, Liara observed silently, her glowing eyes scanning every movement, every flicker of data on the screen. She had fought for this chance for her people to survive, yet she knew that many of her own kind still resisted in the shadows, fearing what this experiment would mean. The pureborn, an extremist faction that rejected all outside interference, had been growing bolder in their defiance, but they have remained silent since the humans arrived. Liara knew it was only a matter of time before they struck. Hannah injected a vial of genetic material into the sequencing chamber, watching as human and Erythian DNA strands twisted together on the screen. There was a brief flicker of instability, a sudden rejection, and then an adjustment. The strands synchronized, forming something entirely new. She held her breath, staring at the results. "It's working," she whispered. "We have stability." Dark Carter leaned in, eyes narrowed. "This is just the first step. The real test will be embryo viability. If the hybrid cells can divide without collapsing, we might actually have a chance." Captain Rourke stood near the entrance, arms crossed, his presence a reminder that science wasn't the only concern. Security had been tightened around the facility, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. The pureborn wouldn't let this experiment succeed without a fight. He had seen it before: desperation breeding extremism, civilizations on the brink turning against their own survival simply because they feared change. Officer Kane entered the lab, his expression grim. "We've intercepted encrypted transmissions coming from the outer ruins. Someone is relaying information to an unknown source." Liara's expression darkened. "The pureborn," she said. "There is no one else left who would resist this openly." Rourke turned to Carter. "How long until the first embryo is viable?" Carter glanced at Hannah, who checked the incubation chambers closely before answering. "A few more hours if all goes well." "Then we don't have much time," Rourke said. "The moment the pureborn realize we're succeeding, they'll come for us." Liara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Then we must be ready. We cannot afford to fail now." As the hours passed, tension thickened within the lab. Security teams patrolled the corridors outside, weapons ready, while inside the scientists continued their delicate work. Hannah barely noticed the fatigue creeping into her limbs as she monitored the developing embryos, each stage bringing them closer to the moment of truth. Carter remained at her side, his usually calm demeanor betraying a flicker of excitement. And then it happened. On the screen before them, the first viable embryo began to divide, perfectly synchronized, stable, and alive. A silence fell over the lab as everyone stared at the impossible proof that Erythia could be saved. "We did it," Hannah breathed, unable to tear her eyes away from the screen. "This is it. This is life." A sudden explosion rocked the underground chamber, sending equipment crashing to the floor. Alarms blared through the facility as red emergency lights flickered on. Rourke drew his weapon, barking orders over the comms. Kane shouted into his earpiece, trying to get a read on the situation, but deep down they all knew what had happened. The pureborn had made their move. Liara's gaze snapped to the entrance, her body tense. The fight had begun, and the fate of her people now hung in the balance. Smoke filled the underground chamber as sparks rained from shattered consoles. The explosion had torn through the outer security perimeter, sending shockwaves through the facility. Hannah Voss coughed against the thick air shielding the incubation chamber with her body as debris clattered around her. Across the room, Dark Elias Carter struggled to his feet, blinking through the haze. His mind racing. The embryos were still intact, but for how long? Captain Rourke's voice cut through the chaos. "Weapons up or under attack. Secure the lab now." Officer Kane had already taken position near the entrance, rifle aimed into the corridor. His earpiece crackled with frantic voices. Security teams reporting multiple hostiles moving through the ruins, fast and organized. The pureborn weren't just a scattered faction. They had been planning this, waiting for the right moment to strike. Liara stood rigid, her glowing eyes narrowed. She knew this was inevitable. She had warned them. And now the cost of hesitation was about to be paid in blood. Her hands clenched at her sides. She turned to Carter and Hannah. "You must get the embryos to safety. If they are destroyed, all of this will have been for nothing." Hannah's heart pounded. She grabbed the portable containment unit, cradling the first viable hybrid embryo inside. Carter moved to help her. But before they could take a step, another explosion rocked the structure. A section of the ceiling collapsed between them, splitting the room in half. A jagged wall of debris and smoke separating them from Rourke, Kane, and the security team. "Damn it," Kane shouted through the comms. "We're cut off. Fallback position now." Carter coughed, waving the dust away, his voice tight. "We have to get to the secondary exit. The incubation chamber won't survive another hit." Liara took charge, moving quickly through the crumbling lab, leading them through a narrow passage that wound deeper into the ruins. Behind them, muffled gunfire echoed through the corridors. The pureborn had breached the facility, and were advancing fast. Hannah's breath came in sharp bursts as she clutched the containment unit closer, every instinct screaming at her to move faster. Her head Liara halted, pressing her back against the cold metallic wall. She peered around the corner, then snapped back, her voice low. "They are blocking the main route. We need another way out." Carter's mind raced. The layout of the ruins was complex, a labyrinth of abandoned tunnels and sealed chambers. But there was one possibility: the maintenance tunnels under the old viavaults. He turned to Liara. "There should be an access point 2 levels down. Can we get there?" Liara hesitated for only a moment, then nodded yes. "But we will have to move quickly. They will not hesitate to kill us if they find us." They took off down the corridor, the flickering emergency lights casting eerie shadows as they ran. Hannah could hear the distant shouts of the pureborn growing closer, their voices filled with rage and conviction. They did not see themselves as murderers. They saw themselves as the last true Erethians, defending their species from corruption. A sudden gunshot rang out, striking the wall just inches from Carter's head. He stumbled, ducking, as another shot followed. Liara moved with inhuman speed, grabbing Hannah's arm and pulling her into a side passage. Carter followed, his pulse hammering. They had seconds before the pureborn reached them. "We need to fight back," Hannah gasped. "They'll hunt us down one by one if we keep running." Liara's expression was unreadable. She glanced at Carter, then at the containment unit in Hannah's arms, and made a decision. "No more running," she said. "We stand here." She activated a hidden control panel on the wall. A section of the ceiling above them shifted, releasing a burst of thick bioluminescent mist that filled the passage. The air shimmered as the mist refracted the dim light, obscuring their forms. The pureborn voices grew louder, their footsteps echoing closer. Then they came, weapons, raised shadows, cutting through the haze. The battle for the future of Erythia had begun. The mist swirled thick and luminous, casting ghostly shapes across the ruined corridor as the pureborn fighters moved cautiously through the haze. Their weapons raised, their glowing eyes scanning for movement. Liara crouched low, her body motionless, every fiber of her being attuned to the sounds around her, the shifting of boots against the cracked floor, the slow, deliberate breaths of the hunters searching for their prey. Dar Elias Carter pressed himself against the wall, sweat beading on his brow, as he clutched the portable containment unit, in one hand, his other tightening around the shock pistol at his hip. He was a scientist, not a soldier, but he knew one thing: if the pureborn reached them, everything they had fought for would be lost. Beside him, Hannah Voss gripped a compact pulse rifle taken from the lab's emergency supply, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline racing through her veins. The first pureborn stepped into view, a tall figure wrapped in dark combat gear, his bioluminescent markings pulsing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He swept his rifle from left to right, scanning the mist. But he was too slow. Liara moved like a shadow, her blade flashing in the dim light. Before he could react, the weapon was wrenched from his grip. A sharp strike to his throat silenced him. Before he could call for reinforcements, his body crumpled soundlessly to the floor. Another pureborn caught sight of the movement and fired a plasma round, searing through the air. Hannah reacted, instantly dropping to one knee and returning fire. Her shot struck the enemy's shoulder, sending him reeling backward. Carter winced at the sudden violence, his mind screaming that this wasn't his world, that he had no place in a battle. But there was no time for hesitation. Survival was the only priority now. More footsteps echoed from the corridor ahead. The pureborn were closing in. Liara grabbed Carter's arm, urgency in her voice. "We cannot stay here. The mist will not conceal us for long." Hannah nodded, already moving. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and motioned toward the maintenance tunnel entrance. Just ahead, a heavy security door covered in dust and corrosion. If they could get inside, they might have a chance. Carter followed, heart pounding, as Liara accessed the panel beside the door, her fingers moving rapidly across the controls. Behind them, another shot rang out, striking the wall inches from Carter's head. He flinched, spinning around to see two pureborn advancing, weapons raised, no hesitation, no mercy in their eyes. Hannah fired again, taking one down, but the second lunged forward too fast to stop. Liara intercepted her movements, impossibly swift. She twisted low, avoiding the strike before slamming her blade into the enemy's chest. The security door slid open with a groan of ancient machinery. Liara didn't hesitate. She shoved Carter and Hannah through before following, slamming her fist against the emergency lock. The door sealed shut behind them, cutting off the battle outside for now. They stood in darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of Erythian biosignatures pulsing along the walls. The air was thick with age, the scent of metal and decay, filling their lungs. Carter took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus the containment unit in his hands, still stable, the embryo still alive. Hannah exhaled, slowly pressing her back against the wall that was too close. She muttered, "Too damn close." Liara turned her glowing eyes unreadable. "We are not safe yet. The pureborn will not stop until we are dead, or they have destroyed what we carry." Carter swallowed hard, his mind still struggling to process the reality around him. "Then we keep moving," he said, "because if we fail here, everything ends." The maintenance tunnel stretched before them, dark and claustrophobic, the walls damp with the cold seep of ancient ruins. The hum of decaying machinery reverberated through the air. The sound of their footsteps echoed loudly in the silence that followed the battle, the tension hanging thick like a cloud. Even in the shadows, Liara's presence was undeniable, her body graceful yet tense as she led the way, her glowing eyes scanning every corner. Hannah Voss moved quickly behind her, pulse still rapid from the adrenaline of the fight, her grip tight on her rifle, the containment unit clutched protectively against her chest. Carter kept pace beside her, his mind consumed with the one question that wouldn't leave him alone: would the embryos survive this, or had the pureborn already sealed their fate? Liara turned sharply down a new passage, the narrow walls closing in around them as they moved deeper into the labyrinth of Erythian infrastructure. They were close to the old biovaults, the last known location of the surviving Erythian archives and storage, but with every step forward, they risked drawing closer to pureborn forces hunting them down. "We should have reached the vault by now," Carter muttered, his voice low, uneasy. "We're running out of time." Liara did not answer. Instead, she quickened her pace as they passed deeper into the bowels of the ancient city, the faint flicker of bioluminescent light beginning to pulse brighter, the temperature growing colder with each step, until they reached a sealed chamber carved directly into the rock itself. Liara pressed a button on the wall, and the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a vast room lined with storage units filled with cryogenic pods and Erythian relics. "This is the biovault," she said, her voice even the last bastion of our race's legacy and knowledge. Carter looked around the room, his heart heavy as he gazed at the dormant pods, the deep silence of the space pressing in on him. This was it, the final chapter of a dying civilization, and he held the key to its rebirth. Liara moved to a terminal at the far end of the room, quickly accessing data with a few swift gestures. She worked in silence, the soft hum of the system filling the void. "How much longer until we can start stabilizing the embryos?" Carter asked, his mind on the task ahead. "Not long," Liara replied. "The machines here will support the hybridization process. We will need to stabilize your DNA with ours. But it is risky. If the process fails, we may lose the hybrids, and all our hopes will die with them." Hannah stepped forward, her eyes scanning the cryogenic pods with caution. "Do you have any other survivors left in stasis?" Liara shook her head. "None. The last of the stasis pods were activated in an attempt to save our people from the infertility plague. But those who remained alive were too damaged to carry on. Our people have failed to reproduce for generations. The vaults were meant to preserve our knowledge, not our lives." Carter frowned as he looked at the inactive pods, their shells cracked and faded with age. "They're not just preserving knowledge, they're preserving a failed past." Liara's expression hardened. "You think we should have let our people die out without fighting for a future?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but the harsh echo of footsteps from the far end of the hall interrupted them. A flash of movement outside the vault door. Panic surged through him. They had found them. Liara cursed under her breath, activating a security lockdown system as the door slid shut behind them, the sound of boots pounding against the floor growing louder with each second. "We don't have time for this," Carter shouted. "We need to start the process now before they breach." Liara didn't hesitate. She turned to the central console, her fingers moving rapidly across the controls as she powered up the hybridization chamber, her voice urgent. "We must prepare the embryos now." Hannah rushed to her side, following Liara's movements with practiced precision. Carter stepped forward, clutching the containment unit, his breath shallow as he placed it carefully on the central pedestal. Everything they had fought for came down to this moment. They couldn't afford failure now. As the whine of the chamber activated, the walls hummed with energy, and the embryos began to glow softly in the dim light, their future hanging by a thread. The chamber hummed with energy, the soft glow from the incubators casting strange reflections across the walls. As the embryos inside began to pulse with life, Carter stood motionless, watching the delicate process unfold before him, his heart racing each second, bringing them closer to either salvation or destruction. But there was no turning back now. Every decision, every risk led them to this moment, and he could only pray it would be enough. Hannah stood beside him, eyes glued to the screens that displayed the status of the hybrid embryos, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she monitored the progress with grim determination. The hybridization process was delicate, far more complex than anything they had done before, but she was resolute, every fiber of her being screamed that they couldn't fail, that this was their last chance to secure the future of two species. Liara moved swiftly through the room, her eyes scanning each screen, her fingers pressing buttons with practiced efficiency, activating sequences to stabilize the DNA further. She turned to Carter, her voice tight. "We must move quickly. The pureborn are closing in on our location." Carter nodded, though his focus was fixed entirely on the embryos. "How much time do we have?" Liara didn't answer immediately. She stared at the monitors, then spoke quietly. "They are a few minutes away at most. Their forces are overwhelming, but we can hold them off long enough to complete the stabilization process if we stay focused." Hannah exhaled slowly, her hands trembling as she placed the last of the stabilizing agents into the machines. Just a few more moments, and the embryos would be safely contained, ready to begin the process of growing the next generation of their kind. But every second felt like a lifetime as the echoing steps of the pureborn soldiers drew nearer. The wall-mounted security cameras flickered for a moment before going dark. Carter's stomach dropped. They were already inside the complex. Liara cursed under her breath, her voice sharp. "We cannot let them get into the vault." She turned to the control panel, triggering emergency defense systems, but they were limited. Without full control of the facility, Liara activated the nearby turrets, but they could only hold the enemy at bay for so long before the pureborn overran the defenses. Hannah glanced over at the chamber. The embryos were close to stabilization, the glow from within them steady and promising, but outside the vault, the sound of the battle was growing louder and closer. The door shuddered as a blast hit the outer wall, the turrets firing in quick bursts to slow the approaching enemy. Carter's mind raced. The hybrid embryos were their only hope. They couldn't let them fall into the hands of the pureborn, but the oncoming threat was impossible to ignore. "We need to make a stand here," he said, his voice low but firm. "We can't let them take this." Liara moved with a fluidity that belied the dangers surrounding them. She pulled out a compact rifle from her pack and began to prep it, the sound of her weapon charging filling the room. "Stay close," she said to Carter and Hannah. "The turrets will buy us time, but we will need to fight." The door to the biovault began to tremble again as more pureborn forces closed in, but before they could breach, Carter turned to look at the embryos glowing softly on the monitors. They were almost there. The process was working. He stepped forward, lifting his own weapon. It was a last-ditch effort now. The only option they had was to hold the line until the stabilization completed, but even then it wasn't guaranteed that the embryos would be viable. Outside the door, the sound of boots grew louder, the footsteps reverberating through the hallway. The pureborn were at their door. Then the door exploded inward, sending shards of metal and concrete flying through the air. A group of heavily armored pureborn stormed into the room, their faces grim, their weapons aimed at the trio inside. Carter's pulse quickened. He tightened his grip on his weapon as Liara opened fire, taking down the first few attackers with precision, her rifle barking sharp and fast. Hannah joined in firing at the approaching pureborn, but the enemy was relentless. Liara shouted at them, "Move now." We're not out of time yet, but we need to make sure the embryos are secure. Carter and Hannah dove toward the central console, both scrambling to shield the delicate container from the incoming fire, while Liara continued to hold back the attackers with her weapon. The biovault was no longer a sanctuary, it had become a battleground. The only thing standing between them and total destruction was the fragile hope of the hybrid embryos. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burnt metal as the battle raged inside the biovault. The sound of gunfire reverberated through the chamber as Liara moved with calculated precision, taking down pureborn soldiers. One by one, her body a blur of speed and efficiency. Carter's heart raced as he crouched behind the central console, his eyes darting to the glowing embryos, still safely contained in the chamber. But the strain of holding off the pureborn was taking its toll. Hannah pressed herself against the console beside him, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She glanced at the central unit just once to check the embryos, their glowing pulse steady and reassuring. But they needed more time, they weren't ready yet. Liara shouted over the chaos, "We don't have long, the next wave is incoming." Carter nodded grimly, his mind working in overdrive. They needed to secure the embryos and get out of here, but the walls of the biovault were closing in with every passing second. Outside, the sounds of reinforcements approaching made it clear that their window for escape was narrowing. Liara moved again, her rifle blazing as she took down another wave of attackers, her voice unwavering. "We need to get the embryos to the secure room in the next sector. If we can reach that vault, we'll be safe." Hannah looked to Carter, urgency in her eyes. "What are we waiting for?" Carter swallowed hard. Every decision was a risk. They couldn't afford to make the wrong move, but the embryos were too important to leave behind. "We move now," he said. Liara nodded and led the way. Carter and Hannah followed quickly, ducking as more gunfire filled the air. They ran through the corridors at breakneck speed, their footsteps echoing in the chaos behind them, the sound of explosions growing louder as the pureborn forces pressed forward. At the next corner, Liara signaled for them to stop, her eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of the enemy. "We have to get past the next checkpoint," but they set up a barricade. Carter nodded and crouched beside her, scanning the hallway ahead. The barricade wasn't impenetrable, but it would slow them down. "Can we disable it?" he asked. Liara didn't answer right away. Instead, she moved forward to a control panel hidden in the wall. She worked quickly, her hands a blur over the interface. A series of beeps and flashing lights filled the air, and the barricade began to retract. "Go now," Liara urged. The three of them bolted forward with everything they had, adrenaline surging through their veins. The hallway was clear ahead, but they could hear the screams of the pureborn forces behind them, closing the gap. Carter's breath was coming in sharp bursts as they approached the next security checkpoint. He could hear the sounds of the enemy drawing closer, their heavy footsteps pounding through the hallways. Liara led them into a large chamber, the doors sealing behind them with a soft hiss. The walls were lined with reinforced storage units, each designed to withstand catastrophic breaches. "This is it," Liara said. "We can secure the embryos here. They'll be safe until we can move them." Carter glanced at the glowing units, the embryos still stable inside them, but time was running out. "We don't have long before they breach this room," he said. Liara turned to them, both her eyes sharp and unyielding. "They will have to get through me to reach them." She positioned herself between them and the vault doors, leveling her weapon as the first wave of pureborn soldiers rushed into the chamber, her voice cold and commanding. "This ends now." The chamber erupted into chaos as gunfire rained down, the enemies advancing with relentless speed. But Liara held her ground, taking them down one by one, her movements swift and brutal. Carter and Hannah fired from behind her cover, giving her the support she needed to hold them off. As the last of the pureborn soldiers fell, Liara turned back to Carter and Hannah, both of them breathing heavily and covered in sweat. "We have a moment," she said. "We need to make sure the embryos are secure and start the final phase of stabilization." Hannah moved quickly to the containment units, her hands steady as she activated the final sequence. Liara stood guard, scanning the hallway for any signs of new threats. Carter stood by her side, watching the door, his heart still racing, knowing that even though they had secured the embryos, for now their fight was far from over. The door slammed open again, just as the system chimed the embryos were fully stabilized, but they had no time to celebrate. The pureborn was still coming. The door crashed open again with a deafening noise, sending a wave of panic. Through the room, the echo of the explosion still ringing in their ears, the pureborn soldiers surged through the doorway, their weapons drawn, their eyes glowing with determination. They had no intention of letting this stand. Liara turned sharply, her rifle already raised, as the first soldier stepped through the door, her eyes narrowing as she took aim, and fired the shot, piercing through the soldier's chest with precision, sending him to the ground in an instant. But the others were close behind, and they were relentless. Hannah and Carter moved quickly, taking cover behind the storage units as the room erupted into gunfire, the sound of plasma blasts and bullet impacts shaking the air. Every second felt like an eternity, the walls closing in as the pureborn pressed forward. "We need to move now," Carter shouted, ducking as a plasma bolt scorched the wall beside him. Liara was already ahead of them, her movements fluid and fast as she led the way down another corridor, but the hallways were narrowing, their options growing slimmer with every turn. "We can't outrun them," Liara said between gunfire. "We need a plan." Hannah fired a quick burst from her rifle, taking down two of the pureborn soldiers advancing in their direction. She glanced at Carter. "We don't have time for plans." The sound of reinforcements approaching filled the air, their footsteps echoing in the halls. They were being surrounded. Carter glanced over at the control panel beside him, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might give them a chance. "We can't fight our way out of this," he said. "We need to destroy the data and the embryos." Liara looked at him sharply. "Destroy everything?" she asked, her voice low and full of disbelief. "We don't have a choice," Carter replied. "If they get their hands on the embryos and the data, this war will never end." Hannah swallowed hard. She knew he was right, but the thought of destroying everything they had fought for filled her with dread. Liara's eyes narrowed, and she nodded. "We'll make sure it's done." The three of them moved swiftly toward the central console, Carter's fingers flying across the controls as he activated the final sequence, his heart pounding as the countdown began. The chamber started to hum with energy, the walls vibrating with the power surging through them. A loud explosion shook the floor beneath them, dust and debris raining down as the pureborn soldiers breached the final line of defense. But it was too late. The data and the embryos were already being destroyed. The countdown was complete. The pureborn paused for a moment, their faces registering shock as the system began to overload. The lights flickered, and the chamber began to destabilize. "We need to go now," Liara shouted. Carter grabbed Hannah's arm, pulling her toward the exit, the ground shaking beneath them as the facility started to collapse around them. "We won't make it out in time," Hannah said, her voice tight with fear. "We have to." Liara's voice was resolute. The explosion echoed louder now as the building groaned around them, the walls buckling, the structure giving way to the overwhelming force of the destruction. They ran as fast as they could, but the exit was far, and the explosion was already catching up to them. Debris fell from the ceiling, the corridors collapsing, the pressure building. Liara grabbed the containment unit with the last remaining embryos, her face set in grim determination. "We fight to the end, Carter, we fight for their future." Hannah looked at the unit in her hands, knowing that even if they didn't survive, the embryos still had a chance, a final chance to secure the future of their people. Together, they ran forward, the crash of the facility's destruction following them as they sprinted for the only exit left standing as the world behind them collapsed in a blaze of light and fire. The last hope for two species had been secured, but at what cost?